Good morning, everyone. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special Tuesday morning seminar by Professor Sophie Coulson. Sophie received her undergraduate and master's degree in geophysics from the University of Liverpool. She then jumped across the pond and took a dissertation at Harvard University, which she completed in 2021, if I remember correctly. At that point, she took a postdoctoral position, a very prestigious postdoctoral position as a director's distinguished fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. And starting last year, she became an assistant professor of geophysics at the University of New Hampshire. Sophie really takes advantage of the observational, the computational, and the theoretical components of geophysics and melds those into studies that really look at the interactions between mantle dynamics, surface processes, and climate systems, and particularly focusing on active deformation of the crust and changes, evolution of the greater coastal zone due to both mantle flow and gravitational perturbations that are brought about by changes in sea level, in our ice sheets, and in the topography itself. And I think we are going to hear about that today. So with no further ado, let's welcome Dr. Coulson.
Thank you. Thank you for the very thorough introduction. That made my life a lot easier. And thank you all for coming out to hear about some of my work today. So I'm going to begin with a quick overview of the different types of problems in earth science that I have typically tackled and like to tackle. And then we're going to focus in a little bit on looking at modern sea level changes due to ice mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet over the last couple decades. So let's jump into it. If I can advance slides here. There we go. So when we consider global climate and changes in Earth's cryosphere and oceans, often we assume that the Earth is rigid. So we have a topography or a bathymetry data set, and off we go with our interpretations or our numerical simulations of our ice sheets and oceans. But in reality, we know that the solid Earth deforms, right? We have deformation occurring within the Earth that can change topography and generate feedbacks with surface processes that have the potential to alter regional and global climate systems. Excuse me. And so, as my introduction perfectly said, my work is really designed to explore these feedbacks between the solid Earth, the cryosphere, and our oceans and climate over a wide range of timescales. So I want to begin with a bit of a thought experiment, or a pop quiz, if you will. So what would happen to sea level on the Texas Gulf Coast if the Greenland ice sheet rapidly lost enough ice to raise global average sea level by 1 meter? And this is something that I hope we're going to come back and answer throughout the talk. But what I want to persuade you of, convince you of through this talk is that answering this question requires a full understanding of solid Earth dynamics. Okay. So when we're thinking about deformation of the Earth, we have to consider the different timescales on which different processes are acting. So the rheological response of the Earth is going to depend on the timescale of that forcing. So for example, at our longest timescale of millions of years here, the Earth acts more like a viscous material, so more like our honey analogy. If I apply a forcing, I apply a stress to that material will flow and deform. Okay, so think convection of the core, convection of the mantle in our Earth system. At the shortest timescales of seconds to decades, the Earth acts more like an elastic material, right? Like our elastic band ball analogy here. So if I apply a quick forcing, I hit it with a hammer, it'll behave in an elastic manner. Elastic band ball will bounce or break, right? So think more like seismic timescales, right? Propagation of seismic waves, for example. And then we also have this intermediate timescale of centuries to tens of thousands of years, right? And on these timescales, the Earth acts more like a viscoelastic material. So here my analogy is silly putty, which I assume you've all played with at one time or another. It's pretty fun. So If I apply a fast forcing to my silly putty, I hit it with a hammer, again, it will bounce or it will break. Whereas if I leave that silly putty on the desk overnight, it will begin to flow and act more like our viscous end member here. And so on these timescales of centuries to tens of thousands of years, the Earth displays a range of viscoelastic behavior. So to kind of put this in the context of the Earth then and the different kind of processes within the Earth system that I've studied, on the longest timescales of millions of years, we have upwellings and downwellings in the mantle that can perturb topography, change topography at the surface. We call this dynamic topography, right? Mantle-generated dynamic topography. And this dynamic topography can change sea level and potentially affect ice sheet stability too. And so my previous work on this thus far has really focused on predicting dynamic topography, predicting those changes in topography due to mantle dynamics over the last 3 million years or so, and understanding how over that time, that dynamic topography has influenced the growth of ice sheets. So maybe in a mountainous region, if we're elevating topography, we reach a state that is kind of a more ideal state for ice sheets to begin to grow. And I've also looked at how dynamic topography has perturbed sea level markers through time, right? So as we record a shoreline through time, if we then have dynamic topography after that shoreline marker has been preserved, then we may have a perturbation to the height of that kind of sea level indicator. And so, sorry, excuse me. And so while I'm only mentioning this briefly, I'm really excited to kind of continue this avenue of work at UT in collaboration with folks who I know care about mantle dynamics, Torsten and others at UTIG. Okay. So then on those intermediate timescales, we have our viscoelastic Earth, right? So on timescales of hundreds to tens of thousands of years, our Earth viscoelastically deforms in response to ice and ocean loads moving around the surface, right? So the classic example is if we have a large ice sheet growing on Earth's surface, the crust will depress beneath that load, beneath the weight of that ice sheet, and the mantle will flow outwards, right? And as that ice sheet retreats, as that ice sheet shrinks and the load is reduced on Earth's crust, we get that post-glacial rebound as the mantle flows back and the crust rebounds beneath that ice sheet. And so as well as looking at this in terms of our ice sheets, in terms of glacial isostatic adjustment through the last couple glacial cycles, a large portion of my work has also focused on understanding these kind of dynamics in a scenario where we have an isolated ocean basin or a lake, for example, that is becoming emptied or becoming filled, right? And so as a lake empties or as a lake fills, we have these same crustal rebound or crustal subsidence processes occurring as we would when we think about our ice sheet example. As well as this crustal subsidence, when our lake begins to fill, we also have a change in the gravitational attraction, right? So this large load that's growing on Earth's surface gravitationally attracts water towards it in the open ocean, increasing the sea surface height close by that lake. And again, this works in a slightly different way to thinking about our ice sheets because our actual load, our lake that is filling, can redistribute itself, right, according to where our crust deforms and according to that change in the gravitational equipotential. And so this problem requires a slightly more complex set of equations to solve for it. This is kind of something that has been a big part of my work too. And so you might think this is kind of a niche case. Where exactly in the world does this happen? But there's actually been quite a lot of scenarios in which this has happened over the last couple of glacial cycles and further back in time. The kind of Mediterranean or Europe region is a great playground for this. There are several isolated ocean basins that refilled during the retreat of our last large ice sheets on Earth's surface and further back in time too. And again, I'm super excited to continue this work at UTIG with folks like Benjamin that are excited about these paleoclimate problems. Okay, So then we get to our shortest timescale of deformation, right? Our almost instantaneous elastic flexure in response to ice and ocean loads moving around on Earth's surface. And this is where I want to focus my attention today, okay? So for the rest of the talk, I'm mainly going to talk to you about elastic deformation, short timescale processes happening on Earth's surface, maybe with a little bit of viscoelastic thrown in, but mainly those elastic processes, okay? So to think about modern sea level change, modern changes in our ice sheets and oceans, first we need to understand a little bit about the physics of sea level change. So when an ice sheet melts, there are several processes at play, which I've already alluded to a little bit, but let's go through in detail. So the most obvious one is as our ice sheet melts, right, we're moving water mass into the ocean. And that redistribution of the water in our ice sheet now in our ocean is what generates that global average sea level rise. But there are also two more slightly complicated things going on, right? So as well as that global average raise in sea surface height, we also have this gravitational change. So again, this large ice sheet was previously exerting a gravitational attraction on the open ocean, pulling water towards it, which was elevating sea surface height close by the ice sheet. But as our large ice sheet reduces in mass, that gravitational attraction is also reduced. And so we end up, the result of that is a reduction in sea surface height close by the ice sheet due to that reduction in the gravitational attraction. Okay, so that acts to reduce sea level close by the ice sheet. The third thing that we have is this crustal rebound. So our large ice sheet is reducing in mass, the load pressing down on the crust is being reduced, and therefore we see this kind of upward rebound of the crust. In 3D, that kind of is an upward motion and an outward spoke-like motion beneath where that ice sheet was. So our topography is then higher than it previously was, which also acts to reduce sea level close by the ice sheet. So we have these two processes that are both acting to reduce sea level in the region close by the ice sheet. And both of these processes mean that further away from the ice sheet, we might see a larger rise in sea level than we might expect from kind of global average introduction of water into the ocean. Okay. So these two processes then generate this spatially variable pattern of sea level change. And on elastic timescales, on our short timescales, we call these sea level fingerprints. And that's because each kind of ice sheet or each melt scenario will produce a different pattern of sea level change. So each ice sheet or glacier, each pattern of melt will have its unique fingerprint of sea level change. So here I'm showing you two sea level fingerprints, one for Greenland and one for Antarctica. And what these figures show you is what the sea level change we would actually see everywhere on the Earth would be if we lost enough ice mass from Greenland, for example, to raise global average sea level by 1 meter. And the same for Antarctica. So if we lost enough ice mass from Antarctica to raise global average sea level by 1 meter, this is the sea level we would actually observe globally. Okay. So as I alluded to then, these sea level fingerprints can be broken down into two parts, right? We think of sea level change as the change in sea surface height, which is G here, which is given by our equipotential surface that defines sea level, the gravitational equipotential. So that can change. And we also have the solid surface here, R, the crust. So sea level change can be generated by either change in our sea surface height, our equipotential G, or change in the crust, change in R. Okay. And so when we calculate sea level change, we calculate it in these two distinct fields. So here I'm showing you kind of the total fingerprint of sea level change that we saw before. And then we have G on the top, the change in our sea surface height equipotential, and R on the bottom, the change in our crustal surface, okay? And so when we calculate sea level change, we calculate these two distinct fields. But actually, these two fields are very coupled to one another, right? We need to know where the ocean load goes to know how that's going to deform the crust. And we also need to know how the crust is deforming to know where the ocean load is going to flow to. So when we solve these equations to calculate sea level, we actually have to do it in an iterative manner, right, to calculate these two fields. But both of these fields individually, both sea surface height and the crustal deformation, have important implications for Earth science problems and also for society. And so today I want to talk a bit more about each of these fields individually. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about sea surface height changes and about crustal deformation in two sort of separate halves of the talk. But first, I want to go back to our kind of pop quiz question, because at this point, we already have gotten quite a bit of the way towards the answer, right? If we take a look at our sea level fingerprints, we know that if Greenland melted by around 1 meter global average sea level change, then along the Texas Gulf, we would see a slightly smaller than average sea level rise. So on the order of about 0.77 meters. So we know with Greenland melting, it's still not great for us, but maybe we're in slightly less trouble. Antarctica, for example, though, if our Antarctic ice sheet begins to melt, the sea level rise that we would see in the Texas Gulf would be larger than the global average. So if Antarctica starts to melt or continues to melt because it's already heading that way, then we know that the sea level rise we would actually see is larger than the global average. So we can already see then that these kind of patterns of sea level change are really starting to impact our future, right? And we need to understand them in order to understand the future hazards that we might be facing. And as well as this, I'll just note that on top of these maps, we probably also have the ongoing effects of the viscoelastic behavior of the Earth, right? And the viscous behavior of those dynamic topography processes changing topography too. So we're sort of beginning to understand, we need to understand all of these different solid Earth processes to really get at what sea level on the Texas coast is going to do in the future. Okay. So those two parts of the talk that I mentioned then, moving forward, now I'm going to sort of zoom in on sea level change due to ice mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet over the last couple decades, last 2 or 3 decades. And first, we'll talk about those patterns of sea surface height change. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to come back and talk about the patterns of crustal deformation. I'm just noticing the mouse over the screen, but I don't think that's my mouse. We have the ability to move that. Anyway, okay. So first, let's talk about those changes in sea surface height from ice mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet over the last couple decades. So as I kind of alluded to, we have these models. Oh, it's that mouse. Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Okay. So as I alluded to, we have these models, right, that predict how sea surface height is going to change through time. And we've been developing these models in the literature really since the 1970s or so. There have been various kind of theoretical frameworks developed to produce these sea level fingerprints over that time. And we've had various sort of improvements in that theory. But through that time, we've really struggled to validate these models with observations from kind of present sea level records. And so what I wanted to ask then in this study is, can we actually validate our models? Can we detect that fingerprint of sea level change around the Greenland ice sheet in the observational record over the last couple decades? And I'll just note that I'm not the first person that's kind of tried to identify the fingerprint of sea level change, but typically people have looked around the equator where our observational record is greater, right, where we have more satellite observations. But around the equator, the kind of signal from our sea level fingerprint is going to be much lower in gradient. And so the best place to really look to see the sea level fingerprint is around the site of ice mass loss itself, right? Around the margins of Greenland in our polar areas, or in our North Pole area. Okay. So what do we need then in order to kind of do this validation, to get an observation of our validation of our sea level fingerprint? Well, we need 2 things. We need our observation and we need our prediction, right, of what's happening around Greenland in the ocean over the last couple decades. So first, let's start with our observation. So for our observation, we use satellite altimetry. So we have this whole range of satellite missions that have been orbiting our Earth over the last about 3 decades now, taking repeat measurements of the sea surface height and how it's changing through time. Okay, and so we're now able to sort of use the compilation of these different missions to give us a map of how sea surface height is changing around Greenland over the last couple of decades. And importantly, these more recent missions have been able to get to higher resolution in the poles. So we're really able to have kind of a more full picture and higher resolution of what's happening around the margins of the Greenland ice sheet. Okay. So this is a quick look at what our satellite altimetry data looks like when we when we download it from its source. So here I'm showing you sea surface height change in millimeters per year as an average over about 17 years, so from 2002 to 2019. And those areas in red are those experiencing sea level fall. Areas in blue are those experiencing sea level rise, right, from the satellite altimetry data set. And so as well as containing this geophysical fingerprint of sea level change, these satellite records of sea surface height change also contain various other information, right? Various other sources of sea surface height change. Okay, so the kind of sea surface height change also contains meltwater from global sources, right? So if Antarctica is producing melt, right? If Antarctic ice is moving into our global ocean, then we're probably seeing sea level rise due to that around Greenland. As well as that, we also have thermal expansion, right? So generally, as our oceans are warming, ocean water is expanding, and that is producing increase in sea surface height, right? A sea level rise. But for the purposes of this study, we're going to say that we think around Greenland, maybe these things are approximately uniform, okay? So if we want to think about gradients of sea level change to predict our fingerprint, to see or to observe our fingerprint signal, then maybe we can ignore these things for now and approximate them as being spatially uniform. The other thing that we have in this signal that is definitely not spatially uniform is ocean dynamics, right? So the effect of ocean circulation and ocean currents perturbing our sea surface height. And the key example of that here is we can identify our subpolar gyre here at kind of our southern section of Greenland. That signal is almost certainly due to ocean dynamics in the subpolar gyre. So what can we do to remove that signal, right? To get rid of number 3 here, our ocean dynamics. So as I mentioned, this is a variation in sea surface height that is because of large-scale ocean circulation, right? Currents at the surface of the ocean. Okay, and it turns out that actually those currents correlate really well with wind stress curl. So actually what we can do is we can take a look at the variability in wind stress curl from kind of a different analysis, and we can see which parts of this sea surface height data set actually correlate with that wind stress curl, and therefore might be induced by the currents that wind stress curl is creating. And so I'll skip over the details here for the sake of time, but that's exactly what we do. We perform an analysis to remove the decadal trends associated with ocean dynamic variability by correlating with wind stress curl, okay? And so this regression with wind stress curl, kind of removing this signal from our data set, explains up to around 90% of the local variability in sea surface height change, okay? So this is our corrected data set. Once we've removed all of that sea surface height signal that correlates with wind stress curl, this is what we see. And you can see we've done a pretty good job of removing a lot of that low that was going on here associated with our subpolar gyre. And we're getting a relatively smoother field once we've done that analysis. And maybe if we squint a little bit, we can start to see the kind of gradients we would expect from our fingerprint of sea level change, right? We see maybe an area of a little bit of sea level fall right by where we're experiencing ice mass loss. And then we see this kind of concentric pattern of increasing sea level rise as we move further away from the Greenland ice sheet. So we're starting to pick out that pattern potentially of a fingerprint of sea level change due to this ice mass loss. Okay. So then the second thing we need, now we've kind of have our observation and we've processed our sea surface height data, we need a prediction of what's been going on with sea surface height change over the last couple of decades from ice mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet. And for that, we use our sea level model. So in order to do that, what we need is kind of an up-to-date estimate of how the Greenland ice sheet has changed over the last couple of decades. And so for this, we use radar altimetry products that give us an idea of the ice height change across the Greenland ice sheet. We then use this sort of history of how the Greenland ice sheet has changed as an input for our sea level model. And again, because we're doing this over a decade timescale, the kind of Earth structure that we're thinking about in our sea level model, the type of deformation that we're going to see is going to be based on an elastic Earth structure, right? Producing elastic deformation. And so we have these kind of two inputs, our history of what's been going on for the Greenland ice sheet, our elastic Earth structure, and we use that in our sea level model to predict sea surface height changes through time due to these ice mass changes. So we're specifically extracting that G field, right, our equipotential, or our changes in our equipotential that generate sea surface height changes. Okay. So here's our model prediction on the far right-hand side here. And again, from our model prediction, then we can really clearly see this area of small amount of sea level fall close by the Greenland ice sheet. And then as we move outwards, this concentric pattern of increasing sea surface height rise. Okay. And so now we can say, okay, maybe we do have some similarities between these two fields, right? Between our corrected observation in the center and between our model prediction on the right-hand side. But how similar really are these two fields? Well, we go and we do a little bit of statistics, right? We do some statistical tests that tell us how similar these two fields are to one another. The first thing that we do is we simply take a section kind of through the ocean on the west side of Greenland, and we can plot our observation of our sea surface height altimetry observation in the dark blue here, and then our model prediction in the light blue. And we can see that while there is an offset between those two lines, which we might expect because we're not including that ocean thermal expansion, right, and our meltwater from other sources, we do see that the gradients of those two lines are really, really similar, okay? So that's a really great indication to us that maybe the gradient that we're picking up in our observation is that gradient created by our geophysical fingerprint of sea level change, okay? We then do another kind of statistical test where we essentially plot our prediction of sea surface height change against our observation and look for correlation. And what we find is that we do have this kind of statistically significant linear association that shows us that we're really having this robust detection of the fingerprint of sea level change in our observation, right? Our observation is really actually very similar to our prediction. So just to summarize this section then, what this study gives us is a robust map of the impact of our ice flux on global oceans, right? And specifically, actually, of the impact on our oceans surrounding Greenland. It also demonstrates that these fingerprint geometries are rapidly established in our ocean, right? Up until this point, it was not really clear how long it might take for these fingerprints to kind of be untangled from the ocean dynamics, right? But we see that on the decadal scale, we actually are seeing really clearly these fingerprint geometries in our oceans. And really importantly for me as a modeler, it shows that all these models we've been running over the last couple of decades are actually doing a pretty good job, right? We validated those theoretical and numerical developments that we were making in the modeling community. And moving forward then, this approach of using the satellite data in this way can be leveraged to applied to other regions, right? So thinking about the kind of most obvious other example, the Antarctic ice sheet, we can now say, can we use these same approaches of analyzing the altimetry data to detect a fingerprint elsewhere? Now, Antarctica is maybe a little bit more difficult, right? Because we have a lot of sea ice and various other processes going on that might make satellite observations much harder to interpret. But again, that's something that I've started working with collaborators on, and I would really love to get folks' insights on at UTIG, because I know there are various people very interested in our kind of Antarctic area and observations of this region. Okay. So that kind of covers our patterns of sea surface height change. Next, I said I wanted to chat to you about the patterns of crustal deformation, right? So that's where we'll go now. So it's pretty easy to justify why we care about total sea level, right? It has a direct impact on our shorelines. But why do we care exactly about what the crust is doing at various places on the Earth? Well, we have these networks of GPS stations and tide gauges worldwide, right? And we use these 3D motions from these sensors to answer various different questions about earthquake and volcanic hazard, about wide-scale tectonics, about long-term glacial isostatic adjustment. And in order to understand and disentangle those processes from one another, we really need to understand all of the things going into our 3D motion, right? All of the things that our GPS is actually recording, or our tide gauge is recording. And one of those things will be deformation due to ice mass loss happening in our modern ice sheets and glaciers. Okay. So this idea of understanding the 3D deformation due to ice mass loss near our glaciers and ice sheets is not new. It's something people have been working on for many years. So here's a couple of examples. We see this is modeled uplift beneath Greenland. We see kind of uplift where we have ice mass loss, subsidence where we have ice growth. And again, on the right-hand side here, this is an example from Alaska. Again, this is a model of crustal deformation, that 3D motion due to ice mass loss along our Alaskan glacier system. And here, as well as seeing that uplift as ice mass is lost, we also see this outward spoke-like pattern in the horizontal motion as ice is lost. But what a lot of these previous studies have in common is that they have focused in the area directly beneath the ice sheet or very close to where ice mass loss is happening. So what I wanted to do in this work is say, okay, we've got a pretty good handle on what's happening nearby ice sheets and glaciers, but what's happening further afield? What's happening in regions far from ice sheets and glaciers? And we also know that ice mass loss varies dramatically from some of our ice sheets and glaciers year to year, but how do these rates actually, how do these different rates of ice mass loss actually affect the different deformation rates that we're seeing? So is our horizontal and vertical motion from these processes varying from year to year, and what exactly is that looking like? Okay. So a quick overview of the methodology again, before I jump into the results. We use a very similar kind of sea level modeling excuse me, framework for this. So we start again with our input ice mass balance for the Greenland ice sheet or for whatever ice sheet we might be looking at. And again, this comes from kind of satellite altimetry data of how the height of the ice sheet in Greenland has changed through time. Once we have that ice sheet history, we can solve our sea level equation again with an elastic Earth to get the equilibrium ocean and ice loads. So where all of our ocean and ice loads are after we've had that self-consistent deformation and gravitational perturbations to our sea surface height. And then in order to get the 3D deformation, excuse me, we do one more step. So using those ocean and ice loads, we then use love number theory to actually calculate how those ocean and ice loads are deforming the crust in terms of vertical and horizontal motions. Okay. So then this is a quick example of our kind of output here. In this map, vertical deformation is given in the color scale. So areas in red are uplifting, areas in blue are subsiding. And our horizontal motion is given by the arrow vectors. Okay? So if we take a look close by Greenland, we see what's commonly been reported in other studies, right? We have a large amount of uplift and outward spoke-like pattern beneath areas of the Greenland ice sheet that are losing mass. But importantly, if we start to look a little further away from the ice sheet, we see these motions extend actually across large parts of the Northern Hemisphere, right? In parts of North America and parts of Northern Europe and Asia, we predict crustal motions on the order of around 0.4 millimeters per year, both in the horizontal and in the vertical, due to this ice mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet. Okay. Then we can also take a look through time, right? So here I'm showing you pretty similar maps to the previous slides, but kind of zoomed in and on a yearly time scale. So we're predicting deformation due to the ice mass loss in each year. And on the right-hand panel here, I'm showing you the horizontal motions on a yearly timescale. So these colored points here correspond with the colored locations on our map, and we're essentially plotting the magnitude of these horizontal vectors and how they're changing through time. Okay, so the kind of takeaway from this then is that we do see, depending on our ice mass loss, we do see really variable rates of deformation as we move through time. So this kind of, as you imagine, scales with the ice mass loss. So in years where we see, excuse me, sorry, I've really got a tickle in my throat. Apologies. Okay. So in years where we see higher rates of ice mass loss from our Greenland ice sheet, we see larger vertical and horizontal deformation in those far-field regions. And we also see kind of a persistent large north-south gradient moving away from the Greenland ice sheet in both of these horizontal or vertical motions. Okay, and I'll kind of, this figure is a lot of information, so I'll just point out what I want you to take away from it, which is that if we look at these far-field sites, places like London, Boston, this town in northern Russia, Norilsk, we still see very kind of significant motions from the Greenland ice sheet, which is this green line, and our glaciers, which is the red line. Far from those centers of ice mass loss, we still see significant deformation in all three components of our kind of deformation field, in the up, the south, and the east horizontal motion. Okay, so the takeaway from this study really then is that these processes are predicted to generate significant horizontal and vertical motions that extend across large parts of the Northern Hemisphere, right? And while these numbers may seem small, right, order of 0.5 millimeter per year, it is likely introducing a kind of a temporally variable, systematic, and detectable signal into our observational data sets, right, into our GPS data sets. And so moving forward then, this is kind of the model prediction side of things, but moving forward, I'm really looking at how can we detect this in our GPS data sets, right? And how can we begin to remove this process in order to use those GPS data sets for other studies and not be biased by this kind of signal that we're producing from recent ice mass loss. Okay. So one more section here then. This got me thinking, if we're having these vertical and horizontal deformations or crustal motion, excuse me, so far from our ice sheet, then what effect is this deformation actually having on that crust that these crustal motions are happening in? And so we know that for hazards such as earthquakes, volcanic activity, it can maybe only take a small perturbation in crustal stress to change the dynamics of these different hazards, these different processes. So what is the magnitude of the stress or strain that we're generating from this process? And is it significant enough to affect things like earthquake activity? So we thought the best place to look would be along the mid-Atlantic ridge on the east side of Greenland here. And that's because we have enough earthquakes in this region to actually reach statistically significant conclusions, right, about if earthquake rates or earthquake types are changing. But we're also really, really close to those centers of ice mass loss, right? We're not that far from the Greenland ice sheet. We're also not that far from all those Arctic glaciers. Okay, so in order to do this, we just needed to add one extra step onto our kind of methodology framework from the previous study. So we have now our horizontal and vertical crustal deformation, crustal motion, sorry. And if we take spatial derivatives of those vertical and horizontal motions, we can calculate our 3D strain tensor. Okay, so that's what I do. And here is kind of what that ends up looking like along the mid-ocean ridge. So again, we have our earthquakes here on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, I have normal strain generated by these processes projected onto a vertical plate boundary along the mid-ocean ridge. Okay, And so areas in red are areas that have extension due to these ice mass loss deformation processes, and areas in blue are those areas experiencing contraction, right? So areas in red actually are places where these glacial isostatic adjustment processes are kind of increasing the extension across the mid-ocean ridge, acting to, I guess, aid the tectonic background strain. Whereas the areas in blue, GIA forces are kind of counteracting our background tectonic strain. So what we wanted to ask here then is, in places where we're increasing that extensional normal strain, in our places where I have kind of red arrows and red values on this plot, do we actually see an increase in earthquake occurrence rate? And can we track that both spatially along the mid-ocean ridge and also through time, right? Because we have several decades of these predictions. So what we do then is we break our mid-ocean ridge up into 50-kilometer segments. And what we do is we correlate what's going on with the earthquake behavior here to what we're seeing in our kind of strain prediction along those 50-kilometer segments of the mid-ocean ridge. And so first, let's take a look at the correlation in space. So here I'm looking at average, kind of exactly what's shown in this figure here, right? The average normal strain on the mid-ocean ridge between that whole period from 1993 to 2020. Okay, and so if we look at those kind of the different ridge segments we have along that space, on the x-axis, what we see is that normal strain, okay? So areas that are experiencing contraction are plotted in blue, and areas that are experiencing, or segments that are experiencing extension are plotted in red, okay? And then on the y-axis, we have the earthquake rate happening in those individual ridge segments on average also. And so what we start to see then, this panel in the middle here is just a histogram of the same information, right? The binned into kind of groups of earthquake rate. And what we start to see is maybe we have two kind of separate populations here. Maybe in segments where we're seeing extension, we're actually having slightly higher earthquake occurrence rates. And because of our kind of small number of samples here, we did a little bit more statistics. We did some bootstrapping to say, okay, are these two populations actually significantly different from each other? And it turns out we think that they are, right? So we think that we're consistently seeing more earthquakes occurring in locations experiencing extensional normal strain because of these GIA processes across the mid-ocean ridge. Okay. So that was kind of averaged through all of time, our correlations in space. But here, let's take a look at our correlations through time. So bear with me a sec on this figure. There's kind of a lot of lines. But what we have here is for a specific ridge segment, it's kind of evolution in strain through time. So each one of these lighter colored lines on this figure is one of those ridge segments and the strain it's experiencing through time. The ones that are plotted in blue are those segments that are on average experiencing contraction, and the ones plotted in red are those segments that are on average experiencing extension. Okay, and the dark lines here are kind of the median of the extension or contraction across all of those segments experiencing extension or contraction. Okay, so this top plot is representing change in strain through time. And generally, we see that through time, we're getting a slight increase in extension in our extensional segments and a slight increase in the contraction happening in our contractional segments. Okay, then on the bottom here, we have our earthquake activity. And here I'm showing you kind of a rolling mean in the straight lines of the number of earthquakes happening in those segments. Okay, so in contractional segments, which are happening in blue, we're not seeing that much change in the number of earthquakes that are happening within those contractional segments. But in our extensional segments, which are plotted in red, through time, we do see a slight increase in the number of earthquakes happening in those extensional segments. Okay, bear with me for one more complicated figure. So if we put those two things together then, essentially in this plot on the right, we're plotting kind of the top figure here on the x-axis and the bottom figure here on the y-axis, essentially. So we're saying for a given year, what we're plotting the kind of median of the locations with extensional strain in red, and the median of the locations with contractional strain, in blue. And we're saying, okay, in each of those years, what's our earthquake rate? And what we see for our years that are plotted in blue then is that we don't really seem to have a clear signal, right? As we get more extensional or more compressional in our strain, we don't really see a change in the earthquake rate. But for our points plotted in red, those experiencing extension, in years where we see more extensional strain, we also see higher earthquake occurrence rates. Okay. So the kind of takeaway from this group of figures then is that in years where we see increased extensional strain, we also see larger earthquake occurrence rates. Okay. So just to summarize that then real quick, what we've seen from these sort of preliminary analyses is that there is a correlation between increasing extensional normal strain across the mid-ocean ridge and higher earthquake occurrence rates. And this actually makes physical sense when you think about the type of strains and the type of earthquakes that you might be generating along the mid-ocean ridge, right? We're already having kind of extensional behavior generating earthquakes, so more extension kind of makes sense that that would lead to potentially more earthquakes. And we see that this correlation is holding both in space and through time, but a little bit more work does need to be done just to quantify exactly how this relationship is working, and make sure this is sort of kind of all wrapped up before it's published. But I will finish by saying that while these perturbations may be relatively small now, that may not be the case in our future. So here, this is the figure that I already showed you, right? Our normal strain along the mid-ocean ridge over the last 30 years. But if I then take a projection of how the Greenland ice sheet is going to change by 2100 for a high emission future scenario, we get a much different result. So while these actually look relatively similar, note that the color scale on the right-hand side figure for how our strain is going to change over the next 100 years, the color scale is 10 times bigger. Right, so these strain rates are really going to change moving into our future. Okay. And I'll just wrap up here by bringing back my kind of squishy Earth diagram one more time and saying that I hope that I have showed you today, convinced you a little bit, that accurately capturing this range of different geophysical processes is really necessary to understand the full picture of climate change and sea level change, and that these processes are not only important for kind of paleoclimate, but also really important for understanding our, our future climate and associated hazards through the next decade. And I'll finish there and take any questions.
Thank you, Sophie, for that compelling presentation. I'm sure there are questions. Does anyone want to start?
Hi, Sophie. Really good talk. Thank you so much. I'm just wondering for the second part, you just calculated the crustal motion just based on the elastic Earth.
Yeah.
And I think from the van der Waals research for the horizontal motion, I think the viscous flow from mantle will affect those kind of direction, horizontal direction. So did you just quantify the effect from those kind of metal viscous effects on your results? Thank you.
Yeah, so I oversimplified a little bit. This is using a viscoelastic Earth model. And so we do find that these deformations are about 10% due to the viscous effects in the mantle and about 90% due to kind of our elastic Earth effects. But as you said, there are some locations on the Earth where we definitely have much lower viscosities. And so these are kind of a simple kind of 1D structure of the Earth simulation, but certainly in future, I would kind of be interested to delve into more those places where we have low viscosities. How different is this looking in places like Antarctica where that's happening? And that would really need kind of the 3D approach that I know you think about a lot.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, just a quick second question and then just to pass to other gradients. So yeah, from here, I just think you just explore the pattern of the crystal motion around I think I can say only for the medium far field region. And I'm curious because the GPS data, for example, GPS sites for the Greenland, they just located around those ice margin.
Yeah.
So around that region, I think the horizontal motion, also vertical motion, yeah, especially the horizontal motion, it more complicated around those kind of ice sheet margins. So did you have any idea on those kind of peripheral bulge?
You mean, you mean associated with the modern ice sheet melting still?
Yeah,
yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, generally, because we were focusing kind of on these further field regions, this is sort of a more simple approach. And we actually didn't check super thoroughly that what's happening sort of around the periphery of Greenland is matching with the GPS observations there. Because again, I think a kind of like more complex Earth structure would maybe be useful to get all those things accurate directly in the Greenland region. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, maybe pass.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I have a question about your sort of first part of the talk and how you said that you have this offset between your observations and your predictions that's due to not including thermal expansion and like far field melting. So if you kind of, I assume you could probably calculate the thermal expansion. So does that mean you could also use this data set to inform the response in Greenland to like Antarctic melting and other melting around the world from that relationship? And is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, great question. And I think like in theory, yes, in practice, it's definitely a little tougher than that. So you may notice I said there's an offset between these lines, but I didn't say that offset perfectly matches what we expect for thermal expansion and melt from the Antarctic ice sheet. And I think realistically, while the sea surface height change from the Antarctic ice sheet, it would be relatively uniform across this region. Thermal expansion is not that simple. And so I think in order to do that really effectively, we would need to understand to have a better model for how the thermal expansion of the ocean is varying around these regions in order to properly remove that signal. And that was something that we just sort of thought about a little bit, but didn't have kind of an effective way to do that at the time when we created these results. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for a really great talk. I have a question about your second project again, as long as I'm keeping track. So you said that you basically need to correct for all of these like glacial effects in your GPS when you're using it for other things. But can you do it the other way around? Like, do you think you can account for all of the other things and then use far field observations to understand the glaciers?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Yeah, I think like it would be really, really cool if we could do that. I'm not sure I am necessarily the person to understand all of those other processes. And actually, I've been talking with folks at Michigan State University about sort of what goes into the reference frame, what we're already removing from these GPS observations to kind of think more about how all this fits together. I think in an ideal world, that would be really great. I do think over a lot of the globe, some of these kind of rates that we would expect are on the order of kind of the error in the GPS or maybe just a little bit larger. So I think that's maybe tough at this stage. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great talk. So the Laurentide ice sheet rebound is still happening, right? And it's really close to there. Is that something you're able to factor in and decouple or work on?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because it relates to several parts of this talk, actually. So in this study specifically, we did predict sea surface height change from that ongoing GIA, right? That the effects of the decay of our large ice sheets since like 21,000 years ago. And it actually turns out that across Greenland, because you're in this area where you're kind of uniformly ice covered, the ongoing change in sea surface height is actually not very significant. It's really spatially uniform across the region. And so we did take a look at that, because it was small and spatially uniform, again, we kind of thought that it was okay to neglect that. I will say in these last figures that I showed you, thinking about deformation and crustal strain, this is actually a combination of what's going on due to modern processes and due to that ongoing GIA. We summed those two things together, and you'll see this pattern is maybe a little bit more complex than you might expect just from melting of Iceland and Greenland and Svalbard. And so that also does contain that signal from the long-term GIA. And I'm still kind of teasing out sort of which parts of that are due to which signal. Yeah.
Okay, online question.
Duncan, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent talk. So on the third, and particularly this slide here, from a paleo record perspective and hazard perspective, have you thought about taking this to volcanism?
Yeah, I think that would be a very cool next step. I think from kind of a statistics point of view, the earthquake story was a little bit easy to unpick. But if there was some way to sort of, create some kind of box model of the volcanic plumbing system in some of these regions and figure out how that would vary as we sort of change the boundary conditions around the volcanic system, that would be really cool too. And that's something I've chatted a little bit with colleagues about at Penn State, but kind of a direction I'm definitely thinking about exploring in the future. So I'd be like thrilled to chat more about that if you have ideas of how best to do that too.
Thanks, Sophie. And now that my colleagues have asked some paleo questions, I'll take it in the other direction, which is outside of my comfort zone. But there's pretty significant seasonal variability in their surface mass balance in Greenland. And
Yeah.
I imagine that you're able to resolve some of that in the sea surface height data sets. And so I wonder if that, and you mentioned about how quickly this fingerprint is established. I wonder if you've looked into seasonal patterns of sea surface change and how they relate to surface mass balance. And if so, or if not, what kind of questions would that analysis allow you to get at?
Yeah, so really interesting question. So one thing I'll also point out is that all of this kind of sea surface height observation, all of this variability is still present after averaging for 20 or 30 decades, right? And averaging over 20 or 30 decades already got rid of a lot of that kind of ocean dynamic signal of everything going on there. So while it's possible to kind of split this data set into the seasonal scale, we really need to think more about how to remove all the other variability that's going on in the ocean, because actually taking that average over a couple decades does a lot of the job for us. And the same thing when we do that correlation with wind stress curl, again, that's over a time period of 20 or 30 years. So we tested through this. We did kind of the longest time period possible, and that got us the best correlation. And this kind of 17-year time period, if we went smaller than that, it becomes harder and harder to see the correlation between these two fields. But I think that's a really interesting problem. And my hope is that if we kind of get better at understanding all of the different components that are being recorded in these sea surface height data sets, then maybe we can do kind of a better job of that in future. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any final questions? Well, if not, we're ending exactly on time. So let's thank Dr. Coulson again for that great talk.